This is Office Hours,
a show for sharing experiences and stories in governance, risk management, and compliance. So Kevin, for 10 years in professional services, fought the same battle with all of my clients. They all have a million different compliance standards imposed on them, and they all say similar things, but this dream, this sort of pipe dream of being able to create one consolidated set of testing and avoid the audit fatigue seemed to always fail.
Yeah, so there has to be a better way, right?
That's right.
Hi, I'm Kevin, Director of Product Design here at ACL.
And I'm Dan, I'm the Chief Product Officer at ACL, and we're going to talk about taking a different approach to this problem with technology today.
Yeah, so let's start off talking about how we as a technology company are trying to help.
And we don't really mean this to come across as a sales pitch. It's really not. This is just how we thought about the compliance problem from the perspective of how could we help. And these are the immediate things we look to solve for. The key principle is we want to make it as easy as possible to check the box. While there's certainly value add to be had in compliance, Kevin, I think we all know what the outcome we're looking for is.
Yeah, at the end of the day, you don't want to be burdened with spending all your time just managing all your compliance requirements. You want to check the box, move on, and get on to running a good business.
So second, compliance should be an outcome of managing a well-controlled business.
Yeah, so if you manage really good controls, manage the requirements that you actually need to be compliant with, your business should be running effectively and everything should just roll out from there.
In other words, we shouldn't have to do audits for every individual compliance standard. Let's run one good set of controls, one good business, and it ought to, by default, cover all the things we're supposed to be compliant with.
Exactly.
Totally. What about, providing a way to operationalize the management of thousands of requirements?
Yeah, nobody has time to sit there and check the box on thousands of different requirements.
Poor friends at the bank with 4,000 to 6,000 compliance requirements we've seen recently.
Yeah, why not take those 6,000 requirements, harmonize those down into a couple hundred controls, test those controls, and then you're good to go.
Totally. So putting control into the hands of the compliance professional. So I think there's a misconception that compliance is really that there's not sort of risk assessment in compliance. You know what I mean? So when you are subject to a regulation or standard, it never applies directly as written to your business, right? So what we want to do is take the internal compliance burden that comes from all of these different requirements and take the level of non-compliance risk taken, or the level of how aggressive we are with interpretation of those requirements. Let's put that in the hands of compliance professionals and let them think about, hey, I'm willing to reduce the burden by this much if I can increase the efficiency or reduce the burden by this much if I'm willing to add a little bit more risk when the examiners come around.
Yeah, it's the same thing as taking a bit of risk to take advantage of opportunity to your business. Reduce some of your compliance burden, take a little bit more compliance risk, check the box and move on, and everybody's happy.
And so similarly, the easiest way to make it so when an examination or an auditor comes around to validate this, if you have taken a bit of potential extra compliance risk, if you have been a bit liberal in how you interpret the requirements, if you make it dead simple to show that authority, that regulator, whoever it may be, the current state of compliance, you come across credible right from the start.
Yeah, we wanted to make it really easy, basically all in one place or one click in a report to be able to show to your authority and your management that you're doing the things you need to be compliant with.
Right. So in order to build software that accomplished those outcomes, we had to think through quite carefully what are the core philosophies that underpin our approach to compliance to make all of that possible. And I think as we thought through that, these what we call the 6 laws to running a smarter compliance program emerged. And I feel, though, from my perspective and the time I spent in practice doing this, and even with our own compliance here at ACL, where we're subject to ISO, NIST, FedRAMP, SOC 2, et cetera, these were the foundational principles. These foundational principles helped us get going faster.
Yeah, these are really the things that helped us guide how we built the software to help people to finding a better way to managing compliance.
Right.
So let's go through those now. So we call these our ACL 6 laws to a better way to managing compliance. Our first law is around think more like a defense attorney, not like a contract attorney.
That's right. And particularly with a lot of the compliance burden is around cybersecurity and IT risk. And the foundational mistake we've made inside of ACL, and that's not unique to us, I see it made all the time, is we look at compliance requirements like they are a contract that every aspect must be carefully followed to the letter of the law. Or as we take the engineering interpretation where thinking like an engineer, I must comply with every letter of what that says. On the other hand, you think about a defense attorney. What does a defense attorney do? Take the law in question and the situation at hand and map those and speak to it in the most engaging way possible to take a bad situation and justify how it meets the standard of the law.
Yeah, really it's about meeting the spirit of the standard and the regulation and the requirement, not meeting every single letter down to the T.
Absolutely.
Really, there's supposed to be guidance towards good compliance.
Totally.
ACL's second law to good compliance is no one needs to score 100% on the exam.
Right. So I like to liken this back to when I took the CPA exam. I was at Ernst & Young at the time when I became a certified accountant, and I used to hate every year when they sent out the email at Ernst & Young about those people who got 100% on the CPA exam. There was probably 3 of them in the whole country, and all I think is, no offense to those people, you're much smarter than me, but man, did you do a lot of extra work that you didn't need to do. A perfect score on the CPA exam is 75%. Why? Because you passed and you didn't do a minute of extra work getting there. I think a lot of these compliance examinations are the exact same way. Sure, we can miss a few questions. The goal is to get the examiner to sign off. So why do we treat it like every single requirement needs to be fully covered? That's where that interpretation and using the compliance professionals' understanding of compliance risk comes in to reduce burden.
Yeah, and the governing authorities know that they're never going to come into a situation where everyone perfectly meets every single compliance requirement. They want you to be able to show that you're doing everything you can in order to meet the spirit of the requirement, essentially.
Totally. Like Congress wrote the Dodd-Frank Act in a way where every requirement was going to perfectly apply to thousands of banks all across America. Come on.
Exactly. Law number 3, choose consciously what level of granularity you want to work at.
So this one's an interesting one. Of course, the vast majority of compliance standards or regulations imposed work in kind of a tree structure. Kev, maybe you could just pull up. This is actually the ACL software. So furl down like the ISO standard there. This probably isn't the perfect example, but every one of these standards and regulations has something like this where there's Section 9, Section 9.2, Section 9.2.1, and most of them drill down much more deeply than that, 9.2.1.1.4.6, right? I think you can make conscious decisions depending on the way controls and that sort of thing are worded. Do we really need to go down to the bottom level of that tree? Or could I say, I'm going to take a little bit of compliance risk. Let's take 9.2.1, market compliant, and we're automatically covered on all the rest of the tree there. And I think making that decision consciously with a risk mindset, again, gives you the opportunity as the compliance professional, reduce burden, gain efficiency.
It comes back to that question, do you want to manage thousands of requirements? Or if you go up a level in a tree and you start working at a higher level, maybe you're managing several hundred instead of tens of thousands.
And do it with a risk mindset and a interpretation mindset, which actually brings us to another good law around interpretation.
Yeah, we think that you should be very aggressive in rationalizing away your requirements.
So I always ask, I like to ask customers, what's the absolute best way to respond to a given compliance requirement?
It's not applicable to me is the best way.
Right. So everybody, of course, says, well, the best way to respond to a requirement is, yes, I'm compliant. But no, that's the word. That's a good way. It's not nearly as good as saying it's not applicable. When a given requirement is not applicable to my business, and I write a good rationalization and justification for that as a good defense attorney, when I write that kind of rationalization and a regulator buys into that, then we have now taken that requirement and pushed it aside forever. I never have to test it. I don't have to come back every year to validate it or every quarter, whatever the case is. So be aggressive in rationalizing away requirements.
Yeah, if it's not applicable to your organization, you're automatically compliant.
And maybe start on the side of not applicable by default and and convince yourself that you have to comply in some cases.
Law number 5, reduce the burden by interpreting, not just reading the requirements.
And that goes back to a lot of what we've described already. But it's easy to read a requirement and read too much into it. And this happens all the time. Interpreting a requirement to say what was really the intent here, and given my IT systems, given my industry, given the strictness of my regulator or my auditor, my authority body, there's a lot of room for interpretation. So take the time to do that, and you very quickly reduce burden.
Yeah, and every organization is different. How does this requirement apply to our situation? Law number 6, test controls, don't test requirements.
And this is obviously the last. This is the last of the 6 laws, and perhaps the most obvious one. But I still see, even though I think all compliance professionals in principle understand that if we have good controls in place and we do these crosswalk mappings to requirements, we could reduce the burden. But what I ultimately see is, because of the way regulators and others work, is we still end up auditing the requirements or monitoring the requirements instead of monitoring the controls. Do the mapping. Obviously, we're biased, but this is where we think a technology solution can add a lot of value, because what it'll do is, once we've mapped those, you test the controls, and we can create reports and views that look like we audited and tested every individual requirement, but really what we did was test the controls that have been mapped. And I think that's the key.
Yeah, test your couple hundred controls and show how you are compliant with your thousands of requirements.
Absolutely. So with that, maybe Kev, give a little bit of a look at what some of this looks like in the ACL platform.
Sure. So I'm just going to pop back over to the ACL platform here. I'm in module that we call compliance maps. Here's where I can see the different standards and regulations that I need to be compliant with.
In this case, you got a long way to go, Kevin, because I see 3,123 gaps against 3,238 applicable compliance requirements. And most importantly, you only mark 2 of them as not applicable. You got to be more aggressive, man.
Yeah, Dan happens to be my boss, so I'm obviously not keeping up with my work here. But just to show you an example, we're going to keep with the ISO example and dig into here. I think a good example that everyone can understand is around user access management.
Anybody who's subject to any kind of IT compliance at this point has at least 5 different, it does for us, NIST, ISO, SOC 2, FedRAMP, etc., at least 5 different standards that have 1 or more requirements that are basically around what you have highlighted there on, when a user gets terminated, we remove them from the system.
Yeah, so let me open this one up and see what's going on in here.
Look at all that requirement description that needs to be interpreted and not followed to the letter.
Yeah, so here is my requirement description. Even an example of a control that you could implement to be compliant with it. And then if we scroll down, we see how that's the requirement we need to be compliant with.
But that's all ISO's language. None of that all comes straight from ISO.
Yeah, this is to the letter what ISO is telling you have to do.
Right.
Then down here, the first question that our software will ask you, is this requirement applicable or not? And in this case, user access management, we've marked this one, of course, this one is applicable to us. And yes, it is covered. And then right below there, whether you mark it applicable or not, you have a field in order to rationalize. This is why we think we're applicable. Or conversely, if we deem it not applicable, being able to add some rationale as to why we believe this requirement's not applicable to us.
That would have been the ideal scenario, but hard for us to justify and say we have no IT systems, unfortunately. So applicable it is.
And then down below here, I've mapped my internal control that covers this particular requirement. Here I have a link to go see the details of that control, but also notice I can see how many times, well, this control hasn't been tested yet. Don't tell my boss, Dan. Mm-hmm. But right from here, I'm able to see how many times this control was tested, whether it's passed or failed, and whether there are any open issues.
And that particular control, LA003, though, is associated with every one of the other 6 times that we're supposed to comply with the access requirement that has some big, long description like the one that was listed up there above.
Yeah, so across all my regulations that are talking about user management, I have one control that map to all of those different requirements. I test them in one audit project on a regular basis, and then that helps me show the regulators how I'm being compliant with all of those different requirements.
So ACL provides a ton of this content out of the box. Sorry, this is the sales pitch portion. But if you are subject to some of these key standards, like the IT ones, you can get out of the box these standards, some suggested control mappings with them, etc. So Kev, the last part there then, and we'll just wrap up. Even though what we actually validated and tested was a control against that compliance requirement, we can report as though we're reporting on the requirements rather than the controls.
Yeah, so I'll just scroll back up to the top here, and we have a nice one-click report, Excel report here. I click on that. I download it into Excel, and then this is the Excel file that I can hand to my regulators to show them exactly the compliance standard or regulation that they're worried about. All of the requirements, whether it's applicable or not to me, as well as the rationale, and my map of my mapped controls, as well as any open issues and relative assurance. All in one handy Excel report. I just click it, download it, hand it to the regulator, and
so management knows what percentage assurance do we have, how confident are we that we'll pass. You see you have each tab along the bottom for each of the different standards, so I can give just the one that's relevant to a given regulator, and you can filter down, manage this list, of course, however you like. So that's the idea. I really do think we've had some good success with this, and for what it's worth, whether it's involving our technology or not, I think it was really helpful in our design process to distill out those 6 laws. And so whether you use our technology or not, I'd suggest maybe considering how you can use those to ease your burden. I think that's it for today, Kev.
Yeah, so thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you next episode.
Cheers.
Cheers.